Okay, so welcome to the fifth session of 6 sessions for this White Privilege Let's Talk gathering or class that we've been doing. You know, the first 4 sessions were a lot about sort of becoming aware and then looking deeper into things maybe that we had seen or never had seen, or just that we kind of got, a little deeper than we ever had, choosing to see, choosing not to see, and coming to understand the way some of the systems and structures impact the conversation and the reality of racism. And as we come to tonight's session, this is really a means of continuing that conversation of truth telling and sort of seeing reality more clearly, but then really doing the work of putting it into our own story. And the effort with that I hope you've been availing yourselves to, of using your journal as a means of trying to put some articulation to a lot of this stuff that we haven't ever talked about in many instances, and to really get into a story that talks about who am I in relation to my own race and to the idea of race being a part of my identity. How am I shaped by that, whether positively or negatively? What's been my experience of race throughout my life, whether I've talked about it never or always or somewhere in between? All of these things, the spiritual autobiography is a really important tool for the continuation of truth-telling and reflection, and I think really seeing what's happening in our world and in our lives, so that then we can kind of continue to maybe make some changes, make some, just make it a little bit more real in terms of how it impacts us and how we relate to it. So that's going to be the topic of our kind of discussion tonight, and hopefully getting into some of what you've been discovering in your own stories. But before we get into that conversation specifically, I want to just gather us with a moment of prayer and a little bit of silence. So would you all please be with me in that spirit? God, as we gather one more time for this important conversation, we ask that you create in us a heart of deep listening and respect for the stories we're about to hear, and for the story that has shaped itself in our bodies and in our lives, but also that is still taking shape. And even where we may not find clarity, or where we may feel a little challenged or odd or even awkward about talking about some of these things, may we know in this space a safe place to kind of keep trying, keep exploring, keep seeking understanding. Because we know that as we find that within ourselves, we will be able to discover it and, by your grace, create it in this world. So be with our conversation tonight. Amen. Okay. I'm going to ask, because a couple people just joined in. Would the folks that just joined in, would you please mute yourselves? And then we'll just, when you raise your hand, that's when I'll call on you. So if you just, looks like Carol and Chad, if you would be able to hit your mute buttons.
I'll find it. No, okay. I didn't. That wasn't it. Okay.
I just hit yours, Carol. I got you too, Chad.
Oh, now I can't.
Carol, you unmuted yourself. Okay. I got you. All right, so everyone's muted. All right, so now if you want to unmute yourself, Carol, you just have to hit that little red microphone with a slash through it. Okay, so tonight is an opportunity to get into some of what you discovered maybe about yourselves in the conversations we had so far, but primarily in the journaling, in the writing, or just even in the reflecting on your life and on the story and the relationship of race to your telling of your own story. So what I would like to start with is before we get into the specifics of maybe what your story is, I want to know what the process of writing your spiritual autobiography or your journaling, what has that process been like for you? What have you discovered just in the effort to write about this type of stuff? What have you found out about yourself and about that whole process? Just like to start with that. So raise your hand and I'll call on you. I see Bonnie. You're still muted. There you go. Yeah.
It isn't an easy process because you're going way back and you're thinking of things that happened years ago often. But the thing that keeps coming up as I write down incidents after incident after incident is how much I ignored other races, how much I was able to just sort of live in my whiteness and not pay attention. And with especially this week with the death of John Lewis and all he went through to fight for the rights of his race and for the right to vote, which we all took for granted. We never thought about it. And so much is what other races have had, struggles with and so forth, I could just ignore.
Yeah.
And just not even pay attention to.
And that's one of the manifestations of privilege, isn't it? That's one of the things we've been talking about, understanding that we can choose when we turn it on or turn it off, or pay attention or not. And that really has been one of the most profound elements of the privilege we're talking about. Thank you, Bonnie. Any other reflections on just the process of writing this story, what it's been like for you as you've been writing in your journals? Sonda. It's just a dramatic pause, that's all.
I just had to find
There it
the
is.
microphone. I'm not writing, obviously I can't at this point, but just reflecting on the different things, it is amazing to me how old I was before I was even aware of Black people, and how very few incidences in my life until I was an adult did I even have any reactions. And I know you don't want to get into specifics yet, but with the riots in Detroit and everything, I was still a teenager. I mean, that was all happening 90 miles down the road from me, and it felt absolutely apart from where I was.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, it's I didn't have to deal with it.
I think a lot of us can relate to that compartmentalization that happens, because our attitude, or I'll speak for myself, my attitude about racism for so long was that it was someone else's problem or someone else's experience. That, well, I'm lucky I don't have to deal with racism because I'm not racist. I accept and love all people. That whole attitude, but it allows you to sort of put off those events that all of us have lived through as being something that's sort of wholly apart from you. And I think that's one of the things I've learned in this class too, is to really see those strands that have always been there that interrelate us, but that I've just sort of made this divorce in my mind or in my understanding of it. And it's like, wow, that's a defense mechanism, or it's some type of a mechanism, but it's a distance. It creates distance. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, Jay, and then Kathy.
Yeah, mine was probably much like Sonda's, because growing up in about 30 miles east of Los Angeles, I got to thinking about I grew up in a white neighborhood in white schools with white teachers, white mentors. Was really never introduced to race probably until the Watts riots.
Yeah.
And even then, that was told to me and explained to me what was going on by a white reporter. It was his perspective. Obviously, it's probably much like our history lessons, and the whole story wasn't told. And you start to wonder, have I been that far removed? And the answer is, yeah, I have.
Yeah.
And, it's embarrassing, really, to go that long and not even realize there are other races who are going through a lot more difficulties than you are, and you're able to take so much for granted.
Right, right. And that's happening today, the naming of narrative and story, the way that, say, the Black Lives Movement protests are characterized in different reports or in different media organizations is quite different, isn't it? So it's protesters or it's rioters, and that whole idea really gives you a sort of along the lines of what you were saying, Jay. It's just such it pushes us in one direction as to the meaning we make of these movements. And we sometimes too readily, I think, look for ways to dismiss the other, or again, distance ourselves from connection to it and let it be someone else's problem. And again, as we've been learning, I think that's one of the aspects of the privilege that we have, to be able to do that, to pick it up or put it down according to our convenience. Thank you. Kathy, I saw you, and then Carol, I saw your hand up if you want to say something, but Kathy Barger.
Yeah. In writing the autobiography, I was struck really with the number of opportunities I really did have as starting mainly in high school, of knowing some Black classmates and relating with them. But I ended up really just kind of staying in the shallow end, and I just didn't go as far as I should have. And I think I'm kind of left feeling, kind of bad about that.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't want to cut you off. I'm really relating to what you're saying. I went through a similar process. And in fact, if you read any of the chapters, the first, John Paddock and John Dorhauer talk about that exact thing that you just named, Kathy. John Paddock says that he starts writing his autobiography, and he's basically just putting in all these instances that make him feel good about how he's been relating and connecting to being an anti-racist, basically, and doing all the right things. And then he realized, oh my gosh, I'm missing it. I'm just using this as an opportunity to sort of make myself look good, feel good. And that in itself is kind of a shallow, or distanced approach. John Dorhauer says that he was trying to name every instance of having a Black person in his life and never sort of looked at the real truth. It was really shallow. I felt the same way. Whereas I started writing and I was talking about how I grew up in a family that sort of didn't look at race. We sort of tried to look at people as, just people, blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, this just feels too milquetoast. And when I got under it, I got a little bit more to some of the energy that John Dorhauer talked about. His was, my dad was a racist and I hated him. But that sort of stuff, to get to that, to get a little bit underneath it, that's really where I think the grist for some of the deeper reflection can come. And I also want to say this, none of it is bad. Like what you just said, Kathy, to acknowledge that you're seeing how, what you wrote is not necessarily the reflection that you're sort of feeling, the rumbling maybe that's beneath the surface. But I think for any of us to just start writing and then continue to dig deeper, that's the key. Every single one of these writings, that's what their reflection is. They sort of like go through it, they write something, it's like, that's not it. So they just keep going. And that's the process here. This is not just like after tonight, we're done. The real work is to continue to work on it, because it's really your life story. That's what it's about. And it's about using this as an ongoing tool to help, keep connected to your own life and to your own relationships, in your community. So thank you, Kathy. And I commend that work to continue. I see you, Jane, but I also had seen Carol just before you. So Carol Williams and then Jane.
I just wanted to say, one of the things that I find in looking back at my own story, I did not have any of the Black experiences. For me, it was all with the Hispanics. And that was the scenario, if that's the right word, of the races and the differences. I mean, I grew up with the Chicano movement, and I had teachers who would try to pair up Hispanics with white students to keep them out of forming a gang, because they didn't want too many Hispanics being friends together in the playground and things like that. So I don't really relate to the Black experience, but I don't think it's any different than what the Hispanics may have been going through.
Well, certainly, I think the experience of people of color, while definitely unique, but I also think that in the particular, milieu or wherever the demographics are, whatever they are, your experience with people of color is really what is going to, I hope, come out in the spiritual autobiography. Just what has it meant? Not just experiences with people of color, but your own relationship to your sense of your race. I loved that reflection that John Dorhauer, I think it was Dorhauer as well. It's like he was writing about all the Black people in his life or people of color, and his professor was like, but you never refer to yourself or your own family as being racial at all. You're just people. And it's that sort of, he realized, oh my gosh, it's that sort of normative aspect. We don't relate to ourselves as being a race, and that's one of the things that can often come up. So thank you. Thank you, Carol. Jane, did you want to say something too?
I'm really relating to all the business. I think I realized some time ago that figuring out the whole racism thing isn't a matter of just your head. That's been part of my problem being white. It was real easy to say I'm not a racist or whatever. As it happens, I've had I was part of the Black community, but I have had to come to realize that it was still them and me.
Yeah.
It was still somebody else. But I have to share an experience, and I still don't know exactly what it means, but it set me back on my butt, I'll tell you that. For those of you who don't know, I was married to a Black man for about 10 years. One year, his great aunt and uncle had their 50th wedding anniversary back in Chicago. We lived in Denver. So we decided to go to Chicago and be part of that celebration. And I was having a good time. We were all having a good time. Somewhere during all the festivities, his auntie called me into her bedroom, and she had me to sit down on the edge of the bed. And she looked at me real serious, and she said, I just want you to know, we're not prejudiced. Meaning they weren't prejudiced against white people. Now, I didn't have a clue what she was talking about because I was so much, you know what I'm saying? I've had to think about a lot over the years, and I've really thought about that a lot since this class has started.
Yes.
Because that was like, wow, totally outside of wherever I was.
And it brings back that whole conversation point that I think was brought up in the first class or maybe throughout the course, but just that whole idea that racism is multi-leveled. And so one aspect of racism is our own sort of personal feelings, our personal biases and prejudices, some of which are implicit, some of which are explicit, but those are the things that come out on interpersonal relationship stuff. That's sort of what Jane might be talking about here. And that type of racism isn't really about the sort of socioeconomic power that some of the systemic and structural racism that we also talked about were. Everyone can be biased. Everyone can be prejudiced. So what Jane was naming was that she was dealing with a conversation there that was talking about that interpersonal experience of being biased or prejudiced or not, in having that conversation. But then on the other hand, we've spent more time, I think, talking about racism as that structural, systemic, policy-driven reality. That is, that's sort of the bulk of what racism is. But most of us think of racism as being the feelings we have towards other people. That's sort of the way we're taught to talk about or to think about racism, to approach it. So I hope that that's been opened up, by this course as well for all of you in some way. Anyone else just want to have a reflection? And so Scott and others that came in late, all we're doing right now is just talking about just what it's been like to try to write your spiritual autobiography. We're going to get in next to some aspects of, more nitty gritty and specifics, but just talking about What's it been like to try to put that down on paper? I saw Susan Moore, and then I see Ruth Ann.
Well, I grew up when I was younger in a white communities. And then when I was in junior high, we moved to Pittsburgh. And in high school in Pittsburgh is when I saw more blacks. And I could not understand why there were fights between blacks and whites, and the police had to come to the school. And I couldn't understand why when we had football games and our school was playing predominantly black school, why there were a lot of police and why eggs were thrown into tubas and that kind of thing. I just couldn't understand why the fighting was occurring. And my sister had a black friend that she brought to church, and there was I can't remember too much about it, but I know it was very awkward for her to do that. And I never really understood. I don't think I've really understood a lot of it. Maybe in the last 15 years more, but I think I'm learning more all the time, but I don't think I have really understood the kind of a life that Black people have to live and how they have to teach their children to behave in public that I never had to teach mine. So it's just a learning process more so now.
Yes, and it will be. And thank you for that. And I think what you're naming here is something that's probably true for a lot of us, is that when you're writing autobiographies, and I think, Bonnie, you mentioned there's so many different events that come up too, and you don't always know how to make meaning out of them, Susan, like you're saying. And so it's like, put them down and trust that as you continue to sort of reflect on them, look at them in relationship to others, just keep cultivating the memories, just digging it, and then putting it down on paper. And then maybe the meaning will emerge at another time. It's not always ours to make the meaning now, because a lot of this stuff we've never really thought about or talked about much. It's from a long time ago. We have these vague recollections of certain situations, a lot of world events like Watts riots, or like Sana said in Detroit, other things that just leave marks in us, but we don't always know, what's the meaning that I made. But if you start putting them down like a jigsaw puzzle, you can start making some connections and some clearer pictures. But that's part of this process, I think. So thank you, Susan. Ruth Ann?
I realized when I was writing my stories a couple of things. One that was disturbing was that I had an uncle by marriage. He was married to my dad's younger sister. He was a racist, and it was really hard on me. It was especially hard, I'm sure, on my cousins, because when my mom came to California to marry my dad, she left her whole family in Wisconsin. So all of my mom's family grew up there, and we were separated from them by 2,000 miles. And so my dad's sister and then her husband and their kids were the only cousins I had in California at all. So they were the ones that we saw. And so being around my Uncle Mac, it was difficult because he was, he had no tolerance really for any race that wasn't Caucasian, honestly. And and in writing my stories, I realized a lot of them involved my mom. My mom standing up for whomever. And I don't think there's anyone in this class that remembers my mom, except maybe Marilyn. Depends on how long she's been going to our church. But, my mom died almost 30 years ago. So you don't know her, but she was only 5'2", and she really stood up for herself and for her family and for others. And she stood up to my uncle. She told him when he used particular language that if he was going to do that, that he was not welcome in her home. And he left. He took his family and they left. They were visiting, with us, staying in our home. And she just wouldn't tolerate that in her home. She just flat out told him, hey, if you're going to use language like that, you're not welcome here. And it was quite a while before they were on speaking terms again. Yeah. But I'm noticing when I'm writing how much my mom really stood up for people, and particularly people of color. I mean, my sister and I love the story, and I won't go into it right now, but my mom almost started a riot on a bus in Texas, because she wasn't going to tolerate, people treating, Black people like they were less than. And actually the bus driver pulled over and asked my mother and a pregnant Black woman to get off the bus, which she did. But she was from Wisconsin. She didn't realize that in Texas it was really totally different. Mm-hmm. But I was really proud of her. She was only 27 years old and 1,000 miles from home, and standing up for somebody like that. It just makes me so proud of her. And sorry, but it makes me kind of choke up now thinking about it, because I just think she was so brave.
Thank you for that, Ruth Ann. And to write these stories, some of which are like well known in your lives, and again, some of which have been buried, maybe you've never talked about, or you're learning as you go, to write them down. I think regardless of whether or not they're a positive story of a beloved one standing up like Ruth Ann's mom, or whether it's kind of a tough one about a racist uncle or parent or something that you realize some of these. If you're telling truth in these autobiographies, the power of them is that you can still stand up regardless of what the example you saw. Because when we tell the truth, when we see it, when we interact with it that way, it does give us a whole different sort of integrity, a different rootedness in what truth is. And so we can then stand up in our truth. But, until we get the stories a little bit more out there, and when they're not just buried, where we can overlook them, and, it's hard to stand up in that because we don't really know what we're standing up for. And we don't know why we're standing up. Ruth Ann just named something that's a powerful motivator. That's a life motivator. And Ruth Ann, whether or not your sense of yourself in your life is that you've stood up, as sort of inspired by your mom, or maybe you haven't, regardless, you can now claim that as part of your story. See, that's what I'm saying. That gives us that chance to stand up and see, and then, move forward in ways that are so different than when we all met the first time and we hadn't thought about any of these stories, a lot of us. So thank you, Ruth Ann. And I understand we've had a lot of people sort of talking about the process now. And so that's how I wanted to do it. And please do feel free to share, like Ruth Ann did, and I think a couple others too, of what are some of those stories that you've uncovered that are truth-telling to you. And now when I ask that, don't feel like you need to speak only the glowing ones. Name the tough ones too. This is not a place of judgment, but it's a place of discovery. And sometimes it's those places that are the ones that are the most raw, but also the most fruitful, or potential for being fruitful. So I invite that too. So just, what are some of the things that came up for you of these truth-telling stories in your autobiographies that you'd like to share? Dick.
I listening to you guys, I'm kind of jealous because I grew up in Marin County, went to grammar school, and I'm not talking about saying I didn't have a Black kid classmate. There wasn't a Black kid in the school for the 8 years I was there in the school. And I went to high school at a private school, and the we had some Hispanic kids, but we didn't have any black kids at all. And we had one Asian guy. And it wasn't really, I went to Berkeley in architecture and there was only one black architecture student. So I just didn't see any, I mean, talk about a white bread background. And it wasn't really till I went in the Army that I met black people and brown people and everybody else. And it was really eye-opening for me. And I feel sad now because I didn't have any problems with you know, my squad mates and everybody else who I knew in the Army. We just worked together. There wasn't, you know. And then I got out of the Army and went to school and just went right back into that white big muffin, you know, that went back to living in Marin County, and just, you know, that's just the way. Now I'm living up here, and
Yeah.
I just don't have that experience. I wish I did. But that's.
And that's a really honest place to be, Dick. And it brings up for me one of the things I heard Robin DiAngelo talk about, and that is when we realize those places of longing or perceived loss, or even some guilt and shame, is it moving us in the direction of like a deeper engagement with that which we feel, you know, loss about, or shame, or guilt, or whatever it is? Is it moving us toward it, or is it moving us away? And that is not, it's more rhetorical because we each have to answer that. But my prayer is, and what her work is that it will lead you toward, that it will not shame you into further silence, into more distancing, into more removal. But that recognition that you just so powerfully shared, Dick, is to say, all right, that's a part of my story, but it's not me. Or, you know, it's a part of me, but it's not all of me. So I just say that's the further reflection. That's where this takes us, to look at that and say, all right, okay, so now where is this leading me? And that's all of us. That's part of that ongoing work.
Well, I feel no shame, but I feel I thought I missed something that I don't know what it is, but, you know. On the other hand, you can't, you know, I'm 75 years old, so, you know.
Well, but I think stay with that. I like that. I like that. I don't know what it is. I missed something. I don't know what it is. Keep exploring that, because that right there is, there's something germinating, you know. And
Well, yeah, it does. And it makes me, as I look at what's going on now, I'm really careful about, I just don't jump to an initial analysis. Oh, well, this is just a bunch of rioters, whatever it is. Or the police are bad guys and the rioters are good guys, or the other way around. You just have to think about it all the time and say, wait a minute, I think this, now let's take a look at it.
Right. Okay, thank you, Dick. Anyone else want to share something, that one of their stories, one of the truths that emerged for you as you were doing the writing of this spiritual autobiography? Is there anything you'd like to share? Marilyn?
When I was in my teens, I believe it was, my grandfather, who attended a multiracial church all the time that I knew him, and I attended church with him, when they were having the marches in the South, he drove down there because he wanted to know what it was all about. And I think that's the first time that I even thought about it. But it was clearly on the news for him, and he was very aware of it. But I didn't give it any thought, not until then. And then wondered, why did he go clear down there?
Yeah, another important story. You know, I think about that in terms of, you know, we've taken our boys on a couple, we took them to the Black Lives Matter protest gathering that happened in Auburn the weekend after George Floyd died. And it was really meaningful to have them there, you know, and it's not possible for them to fully understand it, but to be able to have that and then kind of continue that conversation. And you can too, like you can continue the reflection for you, Marilyn. Your awareness was that, at that time that became your first sense of, oh, I hadn't even thought about it before. And you can continue it forward, but sort of having these moments that right now I don't know how much to be able to, as a 5-year-old and 8-year-old that they really took in, but down the road, we can maybe go back to it,
Right.
kind of keep looking at it and saying, all right, well, what was that like? How does that connect to some of the things that you think and do now? These kind of things. And so that's how this works, isn't it? The autobiography is about the things we knew and didn't know, or didn't know we didn't know, or the things we did or didn't do.
Right.
All these things that then help us to kind of look at, who are we today, and what does that mean in terms of who will I be and how will I choose to act tomorrow? That thing. So,
I think to follow up a little bit on that was, and this is a little bit off track though, but then I saw the picture of Jesus, and he was dark skinned, and I thought to myself, that's not right. That's not my Jesus. And I think at the time I couldn't reconcile that. So a few years later, yes, I accepted it, but it's not of my beginnings and my memory. It's a white Christ.
Yeah.
Not a dark-skinned Christ.
And let me say, thank you for that, Marilyn. Let me say this. There's no such thing as off track in this crew, in this call. It's like jazz. We just go where we go, and it all hangs together. Because what you just named, Marilyn, is something that we will be talking about actually next week, where John Dorhauer, he talks about this thing called a white audit. And it's pretty interesting, but it's about going around your house, and he has his list of things, that he talks about. Going around your house and or going around the church and paying attention to, all right, how many pictures of Jesus are in the church? How many of them are white Jesus? What is it? How many of them are dark-skinned Jesus? What does that mean? All that sort of stuff. Just look at it. Not trying to force meaning on it, but pay attention. How are the images, the narratives, the stories that we receive, how do they impact then what we take away from it? And I think we all know that it does leave kind of some struggle, like you named. Like if we're presented with something, there's a time when National Geographic was first coming out with, what Jesus really looked like, and we saw that, we're like, he's a 5'2", kind of odd looking, dark skin, It's like, that's not the stately, 6'4", Prince Charming, Warner Salmon picture that we're used to seeing, but that's part of how we get shaped in our narratives, in our mythologies, in our religion. Anyone else? I wasn't sure if I saw another hand up. I see Carol, sorta, no? Carol Whiteson? Yeah. Okay. I thought I saw your hand, but I wasn't sure if you were just, because I'm like this all the time. So let me see if I can help you out unmuting it. For some reason, it doesn't let me unmute everybody or unmute you, Carol. So you're going to have to hit that.
Is that better?
There it is. Yep. Good.
Okay. When I was a little girl, I grew up in a very Italian family. Everyone around me, all the relatives, all the cousins, they spoke Italian to each other. So I was never really thought of myself as white. I thought of myself as Italian. And because most of my family was much darker skinned also, and the school that I went to in grade school had, this is a horrible thing to say, but the school divided up the kids in each grade according to test scores and how they would. So I was in the highest group. I was very fortunate. There were 36 kids in that class, and by this time it was in 6th grade. And of those 36, 6 of us were not Jewish. And so I was the other in that group. It was very, but felt very safe. It was all very safe. Everybody did well in school. Everybody read and wrote and, wanted to get an A on everything. But everyone in the class was like that. So it was very competitive. Then I got switched to a junior high inner city in Albany. All of us did. Wow, that was an eye-opener and a half. The first day of school, the vice principal was beaten in the hall by several kids. So I was trying to learn, who do you stay away from? I mean, that was very scary. I'm not saying that he was beat up by black kids. I don't know. But I remember it was a very mixed school, and that was something I had never dealt with before. In my class. In my grade, there were lots of other kids. There were brown kids and black kids. In fact, I walked to school every morning. It was like a 12-block walk in the city with a black girl. I remember her to this day. Her name was Carolyn Harris, and she lived in the Albany Home for Children. She was an orphan. I never thought twice about it. She was just we would throw snowballs and, laugh, because I think I always felt like other anyway, that I didn't even consider that she was other. It was very, and I lived next door to a very, very educated family, very educated. The woman had a PhD, which is most unusual in 1952. And they taught me so much. I was over there all the time because their daughter was my best friend. They were Unitarian. They were very, very liberal, very liberal. And we had that discussion one day when I was probably about 8, about Jesus being from the Middle East, was probably dark-skinned, and they showed me pictures, and I thought, well, that makes sense. I didn't even get upset about it. It just made sense. So I had a very different kind of upbringing and attitude. I was granted I was in a white group with my Italian friends, but they didn't feel that way. Right. They felt other.
Well, and I think, thank you, Carol, for that. There's a lot there. One of the things that I'm hearing there, and I think we've touched on this in 1 or 2 other classes, is that, historically there have been groups that have later become part of white America that didn't start off as being sort of well received or welcomed into the broader, so Italians, Irish, Polish, Eastern European, different times, these groups that are certainly white-skinned and part now you just think of as white, but didn't start off like that. And we talked about how, so there's that sense of being, oppressed for skin color, and yet somehow they were given some of these privileges that we've talked about because that's just part of, they didn't have that sort of defining separateness that skin tone really establishes. That that's not 100%, I get that, but it's just, this is some of the challenge of talking about this, because a lot of, within race and then class, these are categories that can really make you feel, as Carol named it, other. And so a lot of us grew up feeling other. The thing I grappled with was that my dad's family, and a lot of my cousins are redneck, bass-ackwards, in the way of thinking and talking and treating people of color. And, we're talking south of the Mason-Dixon, kind of just racist. And so it was one of those things that I kind of had to come to terms with. How do I love my family and yet kind of establish a sense of, like Ruth Ann was naming, how do I stand up? in my truth, in relationship, in love, and yet also in difference, and being able to name those things. That's been a challenge for me. It's been a challenge for me as a pastor. How do I stand up in the ways that are what my calling is and not what's safe? Choosing to see and speak based on what is before me and not what I want to see or wish to see. It happens to me all the time. So that's part of what I was kind of getting underneath, Kathy and others, underneath the surface, starting by saying, oh yeah, well, we didn't really talk about race much and was colorblind and all. That's true, but it's sort of this level, and it's like, that's part of what I've enjoyed about the reflection and the writing. Like it's allowing me to just kind of get underneath it. And it doesn't always come to completion. It doesn't leave me always feeling, like whole. Sometimes it leaves me feeling a little wounded, but what I trust is it's not over. I'm not done. I'm just uncovering and working with it. And that's why I feel that conversations like this can be really helpful. Anyone else have something you'd like to say? What are some of the truths or a truth that you discovered in this process of writing or the classes themselves, but specifically the writing, this autobiography? What are the truths? What's a truth telling that you discovered? Carol Williams?
I thought of 3 instances where I have learned more about race from children. I remember when our daughter was little, she heard a racist comment, and she started asking me about what it meant and why would people use that term. And that got me to thinking. And another one was just what we were talking about. My boss was Indian, born in South Africa, or Tanzania, and at a family get-together, or an office bring your kids to work day, all the kids were gathering around for a picture with him. And our granddaughter said, because he had long hair, dark skin, said, he looks like Jesus. And because she saw all these kids gathered around him with the long hair. What made her think he looked like Jesus? Was it all the children gathered around? It certainly wasn't the white Jesus that I envisioned. Now that I reflect on these things, it's some of these kids are brought more awareness that I didn't realize until I really got into looking at my perspective on everything.
Thank you, Carol. And how do we see? Kids tend to see with a depth of vision that goes beyond skin. And they're sort of looking at the heart maybe, or just what's just deeper things that are happening than what we adults often see, where we assess on the superficial. So maybe we would say, oh, well, what is it about that? Was it the skin tone? Was it the hair length? Was it the, that soft face? Well, no, it was because this person was acting maybe in this way, like you're saying. And maybe it's not, the point is not to answer it, but just to sort of explore, what is it, because I agree with you that there's something that one of the most hopeful things in all of this conversation about racism and our own part that we play in it is that our children learn, they become our teachers, but that they also continue to learn this way of being with each other that is so much more open and continually defined by that just purity of connection and beauty of connection, and not some of the dividing lines that we continually create, in our families, in our society, in our policy, all that stuff. So, that's one of the things I hold on to, because we can pull our hair out, Dick, you've almost done it. And it's just, we can pull our hair out trying to come up with the solutions. And it's what we do, right? This is class 1. A lot of us are like, I want to talk about this partly, but mostly I just want to figure out what to do about it. I talked to several people that were like, I'm not sure I really want to do a class like that. I thought it was going to be more about what we can do. And yeah, it is going to be about what we can do. But really, this is the work right here. Doing isn't going to get us anywhere. It's really seeing and and reflecting and exploring and connecting and making these things that kind of like deepen the roots of our understanding of ourselves and each other better, that's going to totally impact what we then decide to do. It's going to, I think, more effectual. But I get it, because it's frustrating to talk about some of this stuff sometimes, because it just feels like, you know, for some people to talk like this isn't, you know, what I've heard so far is kind of liberation in talking about truth. Yeah, I feel a sense of freedom maybe in talking about some of those hard things, those difficult people, those tough experiences. But I promise you, not everyone feels that way. And it can make you feel raw or just kind of lost or confused, and all that's okay. Because whether you feel liberated and whole or lost and wounded, this story isn't over. You know, and so that's what I hope keeps us going in it. It's just, we're continuing to write it because we're alive.
Dan?
Yeah.
One of the things that just what Carol was saying about the kids, I don't know how many times I would listen to South Pacific, and you'd hear the music and you see the musical, and then all of a sudden one day I hear that you must be carefully taught. And it just tells me that all of this is taught. None of this, I mean, Hitler didn't hate Jews when he was 6 months old. He was taught this. And we're all taught these things. And our society teaches them. It's not just necessarily our kids, I mean, our families. We don't have to have a racist parent at home or a bigoted parent at home. But the society teaches it to us. And which gives me some sense of optimism.
Yeah, and it's also challenging because society does teach it, or our families teach it. Somewhere we get the narrative, and the problem is that galvanizes the hearts and minds to then accept the policies and the structures and the systems that are in place that continue it. So if we are carefully taught to be racist, then we are going to be nice and complicit with the systems that are in place that continue that. But if we're carefully taught to really sort of stand up and speak a different truth, or see a different reality within our own lives and around us, then maybe, because really the proof's going to be in the pudding. It's not just going to happen. It's going to mean work, effort, deconstruction of systems, structures, and all that. But when we can change the hearts and minds within ourselves, that's when we can maybe confront or stand up for a change that is of a more lasting quality. But I mean, it's not an either or, it's both. It's, you know, it's systems, it's policy, it's hearts, it's minds, you know, and so that's why, you know, this is not an overnight type of work, you know, but it's exciting, and I feel optimistic too about it, Dick, because I'm seeing it impacting me and so many others in ways that feel different. And I hope we can continue to hold that, keep that fire lit, you know, within us. Anyone else have something they'd like to say from their autobiography? Ruth Ann.
In writing some of the stories, I did recall the first time that my son saw a Black person in Auburn. And he was a toddler. He was maybe 2 or 2.5. And I remember it so well because we were at the grocery store and he was in the cart. So he was pretty small. And we went into a grocery store and there was a Black man in the produce section. And my son, you know, unfortunately, he pointed at him and he said, "Look, Mommy, that man is dirty." And I said, "Oh no, honey, he's not dirty. He just has a different color of skin." And then I stopped right there in the grocery store, and it just had to explain to him that everybody is a little bit different, and some people's skin is dark like his, and some people is light like ours, but it just means that we're different in that way. But basically, you know, he's still a nice man. He's, you know, there's nothing to be afraid of. He's just got a different color of skin on him. That's it, you know. And I didn't try to explain it just to say, well, no, honey, he's not dirty. He just has brown skin. That's all, you know. But in a 2-year-old's mind, that's what he thought because he'd never seen anyone that dark.
Yeah, these are the stories that keep coming up, you know, as you remember and you write them down, and keep writing them down, because each time you do that, you will continue to delve deeper into the truth of who you are. And some of them are going to be cute anecdotes. And then later on, they might connect to something else. You know, that's, you know, some of them are going to be tough. Some of them you're not going to really want to deal with, but keep putting them down, because I think this is how it'll keep growing, and you'll start to make connections, and then it'll become easier to see. You know, it's like anything, you practice and you start to develop a facility with it. It doesn't matter if it's a musical instrument or tennis or writing your spiritual autobiography. It really is something that you kind of develop, you know, sort of a muscle for. And it will, you know, you will get perceptive about how these events. You'll remember differently, and then you might make different connections. I do have a video I wanted to show of an example of someone that had a powerful experience of truth telling, and she used the medium of poetry. But before I went into that, I wanted to make sure I didn't sort of cut anyone off that felt like they wanted to add something to the conversation that we've been doing. Yeah, go ahead, Bonnie.
Well, when I first started writing, the first week, I brought up some things that I'd thought about, you know, when I first realized that there were people of different races. And I remember I went to a Lutheran school up to the 8th grade, and it was all white until I remember, well, at some point, an African-American brother and sister came to our school. I remember her name was Phyllis. I didn't remember his name, her brother's name. But anyway, I don't remember what grade they were in, or, you know, I don't think I ever even talked to them. So today I got out the class pictures. Well, I have them on my computer. So I looked it up, and she was in my class, and there was only 15 students in each grade. We had like 30 kids in the classroom. We'd have like 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. And so 7th and 8th grade, she was in my class, and I don't think I ever even spoke to her. And then I started thinking, you know, one point we had African American neighbors finally move in, probably when I was in high school. And I don't know that they were next door. I don't think I ever spoke with them. So then I got out my high school yearbook, and I started looking. We had like 626 kids in our classroom, and it was in our class. And eventually the school became predominantly African American. But when I was there, I started looking at every page, and there was like 27 kids, and every page had 2 or 3 students of color, not always Black. There were quite a few Asian kids. But I went through there, and I thought, you know, of all those kids, I think I knew 2 of them. I just, you know, and it's funny, one of them ended up marrying this nurse that I worked with years later, but that was kind of a small world. But I just pretty much stayed with all the white kids all the time.
Yeah.
And things have changed quite a bit since those days. That was a long time ago, but that was my experience going through school.
Thank you again for that, because I relate to that. It's not like we were all taught not to hang out with different people of color, but I really feel that what Robin DiAngelo said in that first class it comes back again. What we were taught is that there's no loss if we don't have relationships with people of color. It's like we sort of received this where it just wasn't that important. And so for whatever reason, and again, I don't know if there's this insidious, I'm not saying it's this insidious kind of like scheme, but it works out that way so often. And I do think that if we were taught to value the richness of different culture perspective, not out of tokenism, yeah, I had this conversation with Andrea today. It's like, how do we have meaningful relationship? How do we cultivate that? And it's like, got to be careful, because you're not doing it to make yourself feel good. Okay, I'm a good white person making friends with all the different people of color. It's got to be more authentic than that. But how do we instill that in our kids, that that's what relationship means, you know, valuing the difference and saying, hey, that is important to have. You know, we need each other. So yeah, it's good to note those examples, you know, Bonnie, and not necessarily try to make meaning of them right away, but to start noticing the patterns and saying, wow, maybe it was something related to this, and you know, keep uncovering it that way. So did anyone else get spurred on to say something else, or you want to watch a 10-minute video? It's pretty cool. She's a young person. Actually, I learned that, I think at the time of the video, she's 25. It's a viral video. It had like 18 million hits about 3 years ago. And it was in response to, let's see, 3 years ago, I read the article. It was one of the, you know, sort of police brutality incidents. And she had this sort of spoken word poem that she developed and gave on her Facebook. And she's a minister. And her husband is one too, but just something very powerful that she wanted to say, that was very much of a truth-telling experience for her. So this is it right here.
I'm trying to figure out how to start this. There have been a lot of tears in my morning, a lot of frustration, and a lot of hurt and confusion. And my heart is just beating so fast because I feel like no matter what is said, my arms are shaking. No matter what is said, someone will be hurt. But I just feel like something has to be said. And so I'm just gonna say it. And I hope you understand that no matter what color you are, I love you very, very much. And I hope that this is received the way that it's intended. I can't imagine what it's like to be born with skin that's black, not white. I wasn't born rich, but don't get it twisted. See how I look. My white skin is my privilege. I don't get watched when I go to the mall. If I get stopped for a ticket, it doesn't end in a brawl. I don't know what it's like to go out for snacks and end up lying dead on my back. My car's never been watched or followed around. My kids don't play in parks and then get gunned down. I don't know anyone murdered for selling cigs or CDs. I've never been choked out or shot at by corrupt men in PDs. So I won't pretend to know how you feel, but I have something to say that's true and that's real. And that's that I'm sorry for how we've behaved, starting the very moment that you were enslaved. Since we came in our boats and shackled your hands and shipped you back here to work on our land. I'm sorry for scars you bear then and bore then and bear now because of wounds we have caused or allowed. To Black women, I'm sorry we've made you a commodity, using your bodies in secret like a back alley hobby. I'm sorry your kids watched while you were mistreated. I'm sorry your husbands have been broken and beaten. To Black children, I'm sorry that we've made you believe that you are worth less and you couldn't achieve the same heights as the white kids that are in the same class because you are so smart and you are not trash. To Black men, I weep because my heart breaks for you. The mass has been judged for the acts of a few. You've done the best with the hand you've been given. White people, don't leave, don't exit out. Please just listen. I know it's uncomfortable, but you must hear me out. This really is something that we must talk about. I know the history. Don't say it's not true. The past doesn't disappear when it's offensive to you. White Americans would say we're not all the same. Don't lump us together. I have my own name, and that's true. I get it. Not everyone is. But to say race isn't an issue perpetuates myth. To you, I would say that Blacks aren't either. Please open your eyes and be a perceiver. Because if you would just look and be honest right now, you'd see that their mistreatment is what we've allowed. We act like they're poor and less than and gross. We make fun of their hair and their skin and their clothes. We reject them as people, but their culture we keep, like their music and dance moves, their style and weaves. Don't blame the media or call me mean names. Don't act like what I say is just for internet fame. This stuff is fact. Blacks have been oppressed. Cop manage every day to disarm white guys without death. Just being shady shouldn't cost men their lives. Who are doing all they knew to provide for their wives. And this is where you say not all cops are bad. If you've not exited out, I know you're boiling mad. But that logic won't stop me, and I will not be hushed. We must speak for the you're right, the majority of cops aren't corrupt. We must speak for the voices who don't have their own, who went out one day and then never came home. Like Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, or Miss Sandra Bland, not a single one of them held a weapon in hand, and still they were killed and no justice was served. They won't get to speak their voices. They will not be heard because they are dead and buried in dirt. Their families are broken. Their deaths were absurd. Say that I'm wrong and I don't know their stories. Do you want more names? I can name at least 40. I don't want your excuses or religious bicker. It wasn't Satan who pulled the cop's trigger. I'm not against cops, so don't make this about that. These aren't opinions. These are black and white facts. This isn't about black men or white women or cops. It's about senseless behavior that on all sides must stop. Whites aren't all racist and blacks aren't all thugs. All our lives matter. We were all bought with love. To move forward from here, we all need to change behavior, accepted, and futures rearranged. Stop blaming them like their deaths were deserved. We all deserve death, but our lives were preserved by Christ's work on the cross. He paid for our sins so we don't have to make mistakes again and again. Don't scream and don't fight. Start walking in love. Take the masks off your eyes and remove your kid gloves. We can't change the past, but we can change what's ahead. We can change who we are so less people are dead. With accountability for our actions and a voice for our cause, we can form new statutes and create new laws. We can set things in motion and have tough conversations. We can change the future for the rest of our nation. It only takes one person to stand up and say, I won't stand for this. This is not the way. I'm not sorry for this. This is how it must be. I will be changed. Change starts with me. And I know that you guys are going to argue, and I know that you're going to comment and call me racist and call me insightful and attacking. Guys, but somebody has to stand up and say that this is not okay. These lives matter. These lives matter. These lives matter. Your children matter, my children matter, their children matter. We've got to love, and we have to accept that something is wrong, that the system is broken, that people are hurt. We have to accept that, and we have to change. We have to change. This is not a time anymore to be silent. This is not a time anymore to sweep it under the rug. And this is not a time to blame them when they're behaving poorly because they're confused and they're hurt. We have to be better. We have to accept our part. As white people, you can say this is not a color thing. You can say that it's a sin thing. You can say that it's not one versus the other. But the fact of the matter is that we as white people, we have to accept our actions. We have to accept our role in this. We have to accept where we have let them down. We have to apologize and we have to do better. We have to do better. Black lives do matter. And it does not make me a bad person to just say Black Lives Matter. They all do. They all do. They all do. Don't change it to all lives matter. Say their lives matter. Their lives matter. Love them. Love them. And let us stand with them as our brothers and sisters and say that we will not stand for mistreatment and abuse and shameful, embarrassing, unneeded death anymore. This is not okay. And if it costs me every friend on my friends list, I will stand at the top of every mountain and I will use every bit of platform to say to whoever will listen that this is not okay. And I cannot keep living in a broken system, in a broken world where I am weeping over deaths that were avoidable and unnecessary. Do better with me. Do better. If you think that this stuff is not true, then you are going to be part of the problem. There is a problem. We have to accept it and we have to do better. And I say this in love on all sides. Do better. We got to love better. We've got to love better. Please stand with me. Please. Father God, right now, I pray, God, I pray for my American brothers and sisters, God, of all colors, that we would stand together and we would love one another. I pray, God, for my family, God, in the Black community, God, that they would have peace in this time, that they would have justice and hope for a better future for them and their children. God, I pray that my white brothers and sisters, God, that my white family would accept, God, our role in this and that we would do better moving forward. Father God, make us better. Change our hearts. God, I hate racism, God, with every fiber and bone in my body. Every breath that I have, God, is against it. And I will stand against it. And I just pray that you would give me people to lock arms with me and stand against it with me. God, let us be love and light that pierces dark places and that changes the future and the history of a nation. God, we don't have to be our past. God, give us a better tomorrow. God, give us a better tomorrow. Let us be changed. Help empower us, God, that change starts with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Wow.
So why do you think I showed you that video?
Because you wanted us to cry. Oh.
You know, there's something to be said for that, Carol. You know, that allowing things to impact us, maybe if they haven't for a while, that's a huge step. Because if we're not crying, or if we're not feeling something, then we're at risk of losing part of our humanity. And I think that's where, you know, you get to these places, you know, a lot of times. The distancing, the sense of I'm not related to this, they're not related to me, you know. So that's a big part of it. You know, not to be consumed by it, but to allow ourselves to feel it. That's a starting point. Why else? Why do you think I showed you this? Kathy.
Well, for me, it struck a chord. In fact, all of the readings, this whole class has struck a chord of really needing to sort of accept and admit guilt. It's white privilege to say we are not guilty for what has happened. I didn't cause slavery. I never had a slave. But we've grown up in a system that has kept people enslaved. And we have to admit that. And some people don't like to hear that. And I think that's really important. I don't think we're going to go anywhere until white people acknowledge the fact that they have privilege, and that privilege has guilt attached to it. That's all.
It's about seeing our own lives and the truth of life, you know, as best as we can, and not trying to see it through the lenses that we often have, maybe. And I know you can't take off every lens, but some of us have been walking around with rosy lenses for a while, or sort of really dark lenses that really they filter out a lot of the stuff, you know. And when we see, we still have a choice, you know, right? You can decide what you saw is meaningful, or you can dismiss it, or we can, you know, kind of tamp it down, push it under a rug. There's a lot of ways we can respond to it. But what I saw in her, you know, was she started with as she named it, truth telling. Okay. Truth telling in some ways is when we're telling our story, when we're telling the story of the world as we perceive it. Now, that might not be objective truth. I happen to agree with what she said in that video. Okay. I think what she was saying was factual. But truth telling isn't necessarily always about that. But as we learn how to tell truth, tell our own truth stories, and that's what this spiritual autobiography is. I really feel that what that does is it moves us in a direction similar to what we saw in that transformation. You know, she's naming truth through poetry, and then what we see is it compels something. It brings conviction, and it helps us to see with clarity and with a new perspective. You know, when you see your own life that way, it gives you a new leg to stand on to enter the world a little differently. And you saw what she did. She's standing, she says, I'm standing differently. I want to be the change, and I'm asking for you to do that with me. That whole thing. And then she moved from there to deep religion, religious connection, prayer. I thought that was just so powerful. You know, part of it's that she's a minister, but there's something that humbling effect of saying we're not the ones that are necessarily going to have to figure this out, right? If we're figuring it out, we're doing all the work up here. It's not all going to happen up there. So going to your knees and lifting it up in that way, and yet holding yourself accountable, naming the truth, naming that where it's hard, there's something incredibly powerful about doing that work. So in some sense, what that 10-minute video embodied to me was like a nugget of a path that I felt, like, all right, the more I speak the truth, the more I can move in that direction of conviction and making change in my own life for sure, but maybe in bigger ways too. Your reflections on that, even if it's just yeah or nah, that's okay too, because we're coming to the end. We're coming near the end of the session. I did see, Carol Williams.
This white privilege class is the first time I have ever heard about any of this. And obviously this was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
That this took place. Why have I been so blind to this whole white privilege? Why has it taken this point in time for me to discover it?
Yeah. That's a personal exploration. I mean, and just know this, Carol, you're in good company. John Dorhauer, who's the president and general minister and president of the UCC, he talks about it wasn't really until he was 42. So it's not, just because you awaken to it when you do, it does not limit you in your ability to be a powerful force in your own life and in something different. Okay, so I want to say that because we do that a little. I don't know if it's implicit. We often talk about the future of the church is the young people, and I get why people say that, but the future of the church is right here. It's every one of us every day. That's what it always has been. So take that, Carol, and take whatever it is that you've all named, and just keep working with it. Keep listening to it. Keep writing it. Maybe sing it. Maybe make it into poetry. Maybe the writing part didn't work for you. Maybe the journaling was hard. I get that. It's not going to work for everybody, but there's lots of ways to communicate story and meaning and reflection on all this stuff. And that's where it's like, all right, you all have your creative outlets. Go with that. Where is your expression found? Where it meets your depth, the depth of your being, that's where it's going to be effective. So I hope that, that you'll continue to write just as a practice, but if it wasn't working for you, don't stop writing, but try other things. And I'd love to hear, what it is that you're finding is life-giving. Maybe it's painting. Maybe it's doing some other type of project. Maybe it's when you go for a walk and it's the first time you've had a chance to have a clear head. to just think about it, hey, that's all right too. Yeah, so the work is that this is not over. What we've done here is the beginning part. But as Carol Williams said, I think a lot of us would probably agree, we've gone a long time in our lives without thinking about or maybe even seeing some of what we've been talking about. So give yourselves time. It's gonna take time to uncover it, and stick with those stories. When you discover them, get them on paper or get them down somehow, and that will continue to be this meaning making, for you, and give you those roots and the strength to move into conviction and effectiveness. So any closing comments before we close this session?
Dan?
Dick, yeah.
I was reading, and maybe I got ahead. I was reading about Ferguson, and I said, oh, okay, this Ferguson's different, because Michael Brown tried to take the police officer's weapon, punched him in the face, and all this, and the policeman was defending himself. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. The reason why Michael Brown is doing it is he's a product of the society that he's living in. He's a product of this racist society. And that I'm just telling myself, I got to stop saying, well, these people committed crimes, they broke the law. But you look where they come from. They didn't come from what I had. And this didn't start in 1691 or whatever it was, or whatever that the latest thing is. 1500, there was a question in the world: was Islam going to take over the world? Was China going to take over the world, or was Europe? And Europe was the white country, or the white area, with the technology that it took over control of the world. And that's what it's all about. It's about control. It's about people taking control. And once they get control, they don't give it up. Control just isn't going to give itself up. That's just all it is. And so we use our power that we have to continue our society the way it is now. And that means that there are other people who are black and brown who are going to suffer. They're going to contribute to what we have through their disadvantage. And my advantage is going to become through their disadvantage. And I just have to keep fighting that all the time and not trying to make excuses for policemen doing things. These are really tough issues to deal with.
It is. And I do think that's more maybe for next week, some of those specifics. But insofar as that, and this may or may not be what you do, Dick, so don't think that this is not necessarily about you. But insofar as when we do see these incidents come up, what is our reaction to them? Or do we have tendencies? Do we tend to want to rationalize? Do we tend to want to explain? Do we tend to be the ones that have to put it into our own framework before we will sort of make a judgment of it? Do we tend to listen to the voices of those who are the victims in the case? Do we tend to listen to the police officers? I'm not making judgments here, but part of the spiritual biography work is to notice within yourself, what is your tendency? Because that has relevancy to this whole conversation about race too, and the meaning and the truth telling of who we believe, who we listen to. So that's all it's all connected. But I think some of what we'll talk about next week, Dick, will pick up a little bit more on some of those specific incidences that we've seen in the recent years. That then, all right, so what do we do about that? How do we react? How do we respond to those events? But the spiritual biography work is that way of looking at how we've ever interacted or talked about or even connected to our own race, what that means to us, all of those the stuff. And I think in your materials you can keep playing with it, keep stirring these stories or paying attention to these stories, expressing them somehow, because as you do that, it will start to become clearer how you then relate to the events of the day, the news. So, and again, that woman's poem that we just heard, that could apply to, really, that's from 3 years ago, but that could be from now. So that's it's unfortunately continues to be so deeply relevant. But fortunately, this is all relevant, and fortunately, you're here, and that's I just am so thankful that, yeah, we started off and a few of you were like, oh man, it's dwindled. Yeah, no, that happens. Hey, and sometimes we dwindle because people are so done with Zoom. I get it. It's not easy to do Zoom. So I want to say thank you for doing Zoom, for engaging these questions. And I just want to say next week we'll wrap it up. We have for the readings next week, it is, let's see, it's chapters, it's the section called On Becoming an Ally. And there are 5 chapters, but it's really good. And I think this will be a really fruitful conversation. It will wrap up the course, but will not finish the work. So in the meantime, keep doing the work, keep considering your stories, keep expressing them. And I look forward to, kind of closing this class together next week. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Bye-bye.